Narcissists don't target people randomly. They select them through a precise assessment process that most people never know is happening. Understanding what that process is looking for is the first step to understanding how to make yourself invisible to it. There is a fundamental misunderstanding that most people carry about why narcissists behave the way they do in the targeting phase of a relationship. A misunderstanding that makes the behavior seem arbitrary, unpredictable, and impossible to influence. The misunderstanding is this: that targeting is about attraction. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's selection of a target is not primarily an emotional process. It is an assessment process, a rapid, largely unconscious evaluation of supply potential that runs beneath the surface of every early interaction, producing conclusions about the return on investment that continued engagement with this particular person is likely to provide, and the single most important variable in that assessment is not appearance, not intelligence, not social status, and not any of the qualities that most people assume make them attractive to others. It is emotional reactivity. The degree to which this person's emotional responses can be activated, observed, and used to calibrate the approach that will most efficiently convert their emotional engagement into the supply the narcissist system requires. This is where the manipulation begins, not with a specific tactic, but with a reading. The narcissist is observing what produces visible responses, what generates anxiety, what activates the need for approval, what triggers guilt or hurt or the specific desire to smooth over discomfort that empathetic people experience as an almost physical impulse. Every visible emotional response is information, and information, in the narcissist assessment process, is the primary evidence that this person is capable of providing what the targeting is looking for. Pay attention to what this reveals about the specific function of emotional reactivity in the targeting dynamic. The narcissist is not responding to emotions because they find emotional people more interesting or more appealing in any genuine sense. They are responding to emotions because emotional reactivity is the clearest available signal that the assessment's most important question has a favorable answer. Can this person be moved? A person who cannot be moved, whose emotional responses, however genuinely present internally, do not surface in visible behavioral form during early interactions, provides a fundamentally different assessment result. Not necessarily a disinterested one, but a costly one, because a person whose emotions cannot be read cannot be efficiently targeted. The approach cannot be calibrated. The tactics cannot be selected with the precision that differentiates effective supply extraction from the ordinary effort of social interaction. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist assessment process is masked by the idealization phase, by the warmth, the attention, and the apparent interest that makes the early relationship feel exceptional, rather than evaluative. The hidden reason the idealization is so intense is that it is productive. The warmth generates emotional response. The focused attention produces the specific experience of being seen that most people find difficult to remain neutral about. The idealization creates emotional activation, and emotional activation produces the behavioral data the assessment needs to complete its conclusions. This is where the tactical insight about behavioral unpredictability becomes operationally significant. Because the narcissist's assessment does not simply evaluate whether someone can be emotionally activated, it evaluates whether that activation produces predictable patterns, consistent responses to specific approaches that can be mapped, relied upon, and eventually converted into a targeting strategy specific to this individual. A person whose emotional responses are variable, who does not respond consistently to guilt, or who produces different reactions to similar provocations on different occasions, or whose behavior cannot be reliably modeled from observed patterns, presents a fundamentally different assessment result than someone whose responses are consistent and therefore predictable, What most people don't realize is that this unpredictability does not need to be dramatic or performed to be effective. It does not require erratic behavior or deliberately inconsistent responses. It requires only that the person's internal processing of situations is sufficiently independent, sufficiently grounded in their own perception, rather than in the social dynamics of the specific interaction, that their responses emerge from their own genuine assessment of each situation rather than from the anticipated response to the narcissist's approach. Pay attention to what this communicates to the narcissist's assessment system. Because it communicates something, the system is designed to identify and respond to with a specific behavioral adjustment that this particular target will require more investment to model accurately than the available alternatives. And that assessment, delivered consistently across enough early interactions, produces the most desirable possible result for anyone who understands what the narcissist targeting system is actually evaluating. A recalculation of return on investment that makes continued targeting appear strategically unattractive. There is a specific behavioral characteristic that narcissists identify during the assessment phase that functions as one of the clearest signals of exploitability available, not because it communicates weakness in any obvious sense, but because it communicates something about the target's psychological structure that the narcissist system immediately recognizes as workable: the absence of firm, unexplained limits. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's approach to boundaries is not simply disrespectful. It is systematic. Every boundary the target maintains is assessed, not for its stated content, but for its behavioral consistency and its susceptibility to the gradual erosion tactics that the narcissist's control strategy depends on. A boundary that is stated and consistently maintained without emotional defense or explanatory justification communicates something fundamentally different from a boundary that is stated and then explained, because explanation converts a position into a negotiation, and negotiation is the environment in which the narcissist's erosion tactics are most effective. Pay attention to how boundary erosion actually works in practice, because it is almost never dramatic. It begins with small tests applied incrementally, each one slightly beyond what the previous test established as acceptable. Each successful test, each boundary that yielded under sufficient pressure, or that softened when met with the right emotional approach, expands the available territory for the next test. Over time, what began as a firm limit becomes a general area of negotiation. And what began as a clear position becomes a preference that can be managed through the appropriate application of guilt, emotional withdrawal, or the specific kind of persistent, low-level pressure that most people eventually find more exhausting to resist than to yield to. The person who maintains limits without explanation removes the entry point that erosion requires. There is nothing to argue against because nothing was offered for argument. Nothing to reframe because no reasoning was presented that could be reframed. Nothing to gradually wear down because the limit was never presented as something that required justification to exist. This is where social connectivity reveals its function in the narcissist targeting assessment, and it is one that most people never consciously identify, even when they observe its effects. Narcissists do not prefer isolated targets simply because isolated people are easier to manage in a practical sense. They prefer them because isolation removes the specific external resource that most significantly accelerates pattern recognition and most effectively validates the target's experience of the dynamic other people's perspectives. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist's isolating behaviors look, during the relationship, like ordinary expressions of relationship preference, the gentle discouragement of certain friendships, the mild but persistent criticism of specific family relationships. The subtle reframing of the target's outside connections as somehow problematic or less important than the primary relationship. What these behaviors are actually doing is systematically reducing the target's access to the perspectives that would most efficiently produce the one outcome the narcissist targeting most needs to prevent the target's accurate understanding of what is happening to them. A person with visible, active, and clearly valued social connections communicates a targeting environment that is significantly more resistant to this strategy. Not because the connections themselves would necessarily identify the narcissist's behavior accurately, but because their existence signals something about the target's access to external validation that makes the isolation strategy considerably more difficult to execute without becoming visible. There is a quality that narcissists detect in potential targets with a sensitivity that most people never develop in their social reading of others. Because the narcissist's survival has always depended, in a functional sense, on accurately identifying who needs what and positioning themselves as the provider of it is need. Specifically, the kind of unmet need that creates the specific vulnerability that dependency-based manipulation requires to take root. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's early attentiveness, the intense focus, the apparent understanding, the remarkable accuracy with which they seem to identify and respond to exactly what the target most wants to receive is not simply charisma or emotional intelligence in any conventional sense. It is need detection operating at a sophisticated level. The narcissist is identifying, rapidly and with considerable accuracy, what this person is not currently receiving enough of. Validation connection, the specific experience of being genuinely seen and chosen, the feeling of mattering in a way that ordinary relationships have failed to provide with sufficient consistency. And once that need is identified, the narcissist's positioning as its provider creates a dependency that the target experiences as connection. Because from the inside, the relief of having an unmet need finally met is indistinguishable from the experience of genuine relational fulfillment. Pay attention to what this reveals about the function of self-sufficiency in the targeting assessment. The person who projects genuine self-sufficiency not as a performance of not needing anything, but as the behavioral expression of someone whose primary needs are met through their own internal resources, their own relationship with their work and values, their own established social connections, does not present the narcissist's positioning system with an available need to position against. The leverage point that dependency-based manipulation requires to establish itself simply does not exist in the form the system was designed to exploit. This is exactly what they want you to believe, is coldness or emotional unavailability. That the person who doesn't visibly need what the narcissist is offering is somehow less open to genuine connection. The hidden reason this belief serves the narcissist's interests is that it reframes self-sufficiency as a deficit rather than as the specific quality that makes supply dependency manipulation structurally impossible. Most people miss this warning sign because self-sufficiency in the early stages of a narcissistic approach gets tested rather than simply assessed. The narcissist will offer what they identified as the target's most significant need with unusual precision and unusual intensity. And the target's response to this offer will tell the assessment system something important about whether the self-sufficiency is genuine or performed. Genuine self-sufficiency receives the offer with appreciation, but without the specific quality of relief that unmet need produces. The narcissist system, reading this response, updates its assessment of the available leverage. And if the self-sufficiency is consistently confirmed across enough interactions, the leverage assessment eventually produces the conclusion that this particular target's dependency architecture is insufficient for the return the investment requires. This is where responding to manipulation with calm observation completes what self-sufficiency begins. Because self-sufficiency removes the primary leverage point, while calm observation removes the secondary one. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's manipulation tactics depend on two conditions being simultaneously present. The first is the emotional vulnerability that creates the need the tactic can exploit. The second is the target's unawareness of what is happening, because awareness disrupts the specific mechanism through which most manipulation tactics produce their intended effects. The tactic is designed to be experienced, not observed. Guilt induction works when the target experiences guilt. It stops working when the target observes the guilt induction process with sufficient clarity to recognize it as manufactured rather than earned. The withdrawal tactic works when the target experiences anxiety about the withdrawal. It stops working when the target observes the withdrawal as a tactical deployment rather than a genuine emotional state. Calm observation, the specific, non-dramatic recognition of what is happening, communicated through behavioral response rather than through explicit accusation, signals to the narcissist assessment system that the second condition has been compromised. Pay attention to what happens when this signal is consistently produced across multiple interactions, because the narcissist system responds to it with a specific behavioral shift that reveals the assessment updating in real time. The intensity of the manipulation attempts either escalates as the system attempts to breach awareness through force, or it diminishes as the assessment concludes that the awareness level makes this particular target too costly to continue investing in. Most people miss this warning sign because the escalation looks like the dynamic intensifying, which it is. The hidden reason the intensification is actually a positive signal is that it communicates something the narcissist system would never directly express: that the awareness has been detected, and that the assessment is now actively evaluating whether the investment of continued targeting can be justified against the resistance that awareness represents. There is a final behavioral signal that communicates something to the narcissist assessment system that all the preceding signals, taken together, have been building toward a signal that operates not through any single dramatic communication, but through the accumulated behavioral evidence of a pattern that the narcissist system eventually cannot interpret as anything other than what it actually is: diminishing returns. Strategic disengagement does not announce itself. It does not produce the dramatic withdrawal that would itself become a supply source through the conflict, the pursuit, and the re-engagement dynamic that visible withdrawal reliably generates. It simply produces gradually and undramatically fewer responses, shorter interactions, less emotional investment in each exchange, less availability at the specific moments when the narcissist system has historically been most able to extract supply. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist assessment of any ongoing targeting investment is continuously updated based on the return that investment produces. And a return that was previously adequate but is now consistently diminishing triggers the same assessment response that insufficient return triggered at the beginning. A recalculation of whether continued investment is justified. Most people miss this warning sign because strategic disengagement looks, from the inside, like simply becoming less engaged. The hidden reason it functions as one of the most effective signals available is structural. It removes supply without creating conflict, reduces availability without producing the dramatic absence that would itself require management, and consistently delivers the assessment update that all other signals were preparing the system to receive. That this particular environment is no longer producing adequate return on the investment of continued targeting. And that conclusion, reached gradually, updated continuously, and confirmed consistently across enough interactions, is the one that the narcissist system was always most likely to act on. When you examine the complete picture, emotional reactivity, removed as the primary assessment signal, behavioral unpredictability, dismantling the modeling process that calibration depends on, firm, unexplained boundaries, eliminating the erosion entry points that gradual violation requires, social connectivity, raising the operational cost and risk of the isolation strategy, self-sufficiency, removing the leverage point that dependency Based manipulation needs to establish itself. Calm observation compromising, the unawareness that tactics require to produce their intended effects, and strategic disengagement, consistently delivering diminishing returns that update the investment assessment toward the conclusion that continued targeting is not justified. What emerges is not a collection of individual defensive measures. It is a coherent portrait of a person whose internal and behavioral architecture simply does not provide what the narcissist targeting system was designed to extract. What most people don't realize is that narcissists do not stop targeting someone because they develop affection, respect, or any genuine positive regard for them. They stop targeting someone because the assessment system concludes that the return on investment is insufficient relative to the alternatives available. The targeting was always a resource allocation decision, and the most effective way to alter a resource allocation decision is to alter the resource calculation. Change what each interaction produces, and the assessment changes with it. Not because the narcissist chose to stop, but because the system concluded, through the accumulated evidence of insufficient return, that there was nothing here worth continuing to pursue.